Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that Madison is keeping a secret from Chelsea, a small, stubborn thing folded into the late hours when the house was quiet, a thing Madison touched and smoothed like a living lie. It was the kind of secret that floats at the edges of conversation, a shadow that grows longer when the lights go down and everyone else swears they've seen nothing at all. When Chelsea was finally brought back from Allison's makeshift chapel of horrors, when hands that had been tearing at her were finally pried loose and the ambulance lights had long since dimmed, the room where she and Madison reunited felt too small to contain the silence between them. Naomi, always practical in the way people who survive by being useful must be, had been the first to create a ring of space around the two of them. She made it an act of choreography, a polite redirect, a flirtatious smile to the cameras that inevitably crowded 3 yards beyond the threshold, a whispered excuse to the reporters perched like birds on the curb. "Give them 10, she said. "Give them grace." And then she retreated, though not out of ignorance. Naomi watched, the way someone watches a match being struck and knows exactly how fast the fire will spread. Chelsea had thrown herself into Madison the moment the door had closed behind Naomi. She clung as if there were a literal seam joining their bodies, fingers digging into Madison's shoulders, her face buried against the other woman's collarbone. "I was so scared," she said into the fabric, small words that held whole nights of terror. "I thought," the sentence broke, a brittle thing. Chelsea's breaths were ragged. "I only wanted you." It read like an immediate truth, the near hysterical confession of someone who had been held, humiliated, forced into some grotesque parody of a marriage. No one could argue with that. But while Chelsea spoke, Madison's hands trembled, mapping circles on Chelsea's back with movement that could have been comfort or calculation. There was a way her palm lingered a beat too long over the place where Chelsea had been bruised, as if she could smooth the pain down into paper and hide it there. Chelsea felt safe in that grip for the first time since the night when Allison had closed the door, safe enough to imagine a future that did not smell like antiseptic and fear. Naomi, watching from the doorway, took in everything. The way Madison's smile never quite reached her eyes, the way her thumbs fiddled with the hem of Chelsea's coat, fingers finding and refining the same loose thread. Naomi catalogued small betrayals and pockets of truth the way other people collected postcards. Chelsea was raw. She had been plucked from a life that was half camera flash and half polished surface and plunged into a private, obscene ritual orchestrated by someone who seemed to think that love could be proved by spectacle. She told herself in fits and starts, on the sofa while the hot water in the kettle went cold on the stove, that it felt like the last card in a deck where all the other hands were stacked. "Maybe I've been doing the wrong thing," she admitted one evening, words that sounded like surrender. "Maybe being famous is," she swallowed. "Maybe it's not worth it." She pictured the wedding Allison had staged. Flowers that looked as if someone had tried to dye them with ash, candles that burned with a fragrance that choked instead of soothed, and Allison smiling at her as if she had won something. There was a small part of Chelsea that tried to treat it like theater after the fact, a scene to be critiqued, lines to be parsed, but the body remembers things the mind categorizes. Chelsea's skin remembered being pinned, her ears remembered the hush when all the cameras had been taken away. The absence of the public's roar like a physical pressure. She imagined the cameras that sold her fame. Without them she felt stripped down, naked in the way strangers are naked to one another in hospital rooms. The public consumed a persona, the private left a mark. Naomi's voice was practical and soft. "You were born to be noticed," she told Chelsea once, when the young woman asked if she should walk away from it all. "Not because it's a talentless accident, because you know how to hold a moment in your hands. Don't throw that away because someone else tried to break you." Naomi said it like an injunction and a benediction at the same time. She'd been the one to shut the curtains when the reporters edged forward, the one to hand Chelsea tissues and offer a stiff drink. It was the kind of encouragement that smelled faintly of survival. Use what you have, because the world capitalizes on tragedy if you let it. That idea that Chelsea's sorrow could be refashioned into a comeback arrived at the doorstep of Anita Dupree in the form of Kat's excited, halting recounting of Chelsea's fight. Kat loved telling stories the way others love perfume, luxuriant and detailed. "She fought like hell," Kat told Anita over the phone, voice charged with the kind of awe that only true witness can give. This isn't just starlet resilience. She went through hell and came out swinging. Anita, who had grown up in rooms where words were used to direct people and silence was a tool of its own, sat with the story and felt something shift. She is the future of Dupree, she told Vernon, not as a question but as a settled fact. Dupree wasn't just a brand. It was a name stitched into the hem of a family's legacy. Anita saw Chelsea like someone sees a raw stone that could be polished until it reflected the world. She thought of the wallet to launch the botched PR, the missed release that Chelsea had abandoned in the chaos, and she tasted possibility. A comeback, handled properly, could reshape the narrative from victimhood into archetype, survivor as icon. She offered help with an economy of language that meant a great deal, connections, discreet photographers, a small, carefully managed campaign to reintroduce Chelsea as a woman who had reclaimed herself, and an event that would be private enough to re-establish control but public enough to reset the record. But Chelsea bristled at the notion. "I don't want to be used," she said simply, eyes hard with a fledgling defiance. "I'll do it my way." "She can," Anita told Vernon later, an ache almost like pride in her voice. "She has the strength. I can help. But she'll be the one who walks the path." Anita's hand found Vernon's across the mahogany table the way people of long relationships find anchors in small gestures. "We put our name on those who deserve it." Her statement sat heavy in the room like an unspoken covenant. Where the adults formed strategies and futures, Madison hovered on the edges like a shadow not yet decided. She had been the one to breathe life into Chelsea's public persona in the first place. Intimate knowledge, the quiet care behind the curtain, and returning to that intimacy had been almost instinctive after the rescue. Chelsea's gratitude was immediate. She held Madison like air she needed to breathe. Yet there were times when Madison's hands tightened into a fist at the same phrase, "I only wanted you." It was structurally a confession but emotionally a frontier. Madison's eyes would dart away. She would laugh in a way that sounded like someone trying to fill a room with noise so their own thoughts wouldn't echo. Naomi watched that, an anthropologist of human flaw. She had a gift for noticing patterns other people pretended weren't there. The way Madison checked her phone and flipped it face down, the new habit of leaving rooms before the cameras could follow, the late-night outings with no explanation. Naomi made mental notes and converted them into quiet suspicions. It began as curiosity and cooled into concern. Naomi wondered if Allison had planned the kidnapping as some elaborate proof of devotion, an assertion that if Chelsea truly loved Madison she would come through unscathed. Then who was in on it? Naomi knew how small betrayals worked. Often they were committed with the best intentions, or at least with reasons that made sense to the person who chose them. Madison had not been acting like a villain. She was tender, even apologetic when Chelsea flinched at certain touches, always saying the right thing. Yet in the in-between places, the cigarette tossed out of sight, the too quick nod to someone on the street, Naomi found her anchor in suspicion. A secret could be harmless, or it could be a shovel in a relationship's foundation. Naomi pressed her ear to that quiet and listened. It wasn't malicious to imagine motives. People built castles of meaning out of rumor and possibility each day. But Naomi had seen too many fairy tales end with a very human truth, that people are messy, and mess often multiplies when fear is present. Could Madison have agreed, even in a small, whispered way, to a setup meant to test Chelsea? Could she have been blackmailed? Could she have been foolishly convinced that such a betrayal would prove love stronger afterward? Naomi could see the ways a gamble could be rationalized: convince Chelsea to renounce the spotlight and then reward her with a private life, or force Chelsea to confront the raw edges of fame and, through that trial, reassess what mattered. It was monstrous. But monsters take human shapes and make plausible arguments. Madison herself carried her own private litany of defenses. She thought of all the times Chelsea had been distant, of late nights hunched over scripts or obligations, of an intimacy stretched thin by appointments and fan messages. "It's easier to keep her," Madison told herself on a bad night, her voice low in the dark. It sounded like love because in its origin it was meant to be love. Yet love bent into possession like old metal under heat. She had not intended for Chelsea to be hurt. She had promised herself she would never do that. And still the memory of Allison's soft, persuasive cadence clawed at her. Allison had not been cruel for cruelty's sake. She argued in syllogisms and merciful half-truths that were familiar to anyone who has ever been convinced by a calm voice in a storm. "Think of the proof," Allison had said, soothing and clinical. "Think of the story that will be told to women who withstood shock and emerged united. You will be the one who stayed." "I only want to make sure she means it." Madison had believed for a while that staging danger could elicit a definitive answer. It was a childish calculus, the sort that might sound intelligent when recited by someone who had convinced herself they were doing good. The complexity of human fear is not a test tube experiment, it is a tsunami. Someone gives you the wetness at your neck and asks whether you will swim. People drown when asked to prove they can swim on someone else's terms. There were physical traces of those choices. Of course, a receipt discovered in the pocket of a coat that did not belong to Chelsea but in the laundry hamper nonetheless. A photo of Madison and Allison smiling at a small, private party weeks before, one woman's arm looped casually around the other as if invitation were natural, an email stub with an elongated thread that hinted at a conversation moving from light to something more urgent. Naomi could have overlooked these things, but she tallied them. She had learned early in life that denial was expensive and that a small piece of evidence was worth more than 1,000 reassurances. The receipts suggest a timeline and the photo suggested a previous intimacy. Together they sketched possibilities that could not be easily dismissed. Chelsea, meanwhile, wandered the boundaries of recovery in jagged steps. She would wake in the middle of the night, flinching at the sound of a door closing, or she would replay the moment when Allison had drawn the veil and called it a union. Some nights she felt the echo of that voice inside her own chest, and sometimes she wondered whether her willingness to forgive, to cradle Madison and tell herself that love is messy and complicated, was an act of bravery or the first trap of a longer, more painful lesson. She thought of changing everything. "I can design," she said to Naomi once. A small spark of practical fantasy. "Maybe I'll make wallets, discreet things, simple, private." The wallet launch that Anita had tried to resurrect languished like a promise made by a politician and then broken. The product never launched, and Chelsea's name was written across the failure in scathing headlines that made the world anonymous in its cruelty. The internet had no capacity for nuance, it arranged things into binaries, guilty or heroic, weak or strong. Chelsea hated the idea of being categorized. She wanted to curate the terms of her own story. When Kat told the tale of Chelsea's fight to Anita, there was a kind of electric energy that crisscrossed Anita's office. "She stood up," Kat said. "She fought until she had room to breathe." It is a powerful image. People resound with images of themselves victorious because victory is an uncomplicated thing. It happens or it does not. Less often do people reckon with the messy labor of survival, the nights of nausea, the attempts at sleep, the fear-laced mornings. But that was not the narrative Anita needed. She needed a phoenix story that could be folded into the brand, a woman who was both wounded and triumphant, who would partner with Dupree's aesthetic of resilience. Anita's vision was surgical. She saw the wallet launch revived as a narrative pivot, instead of a failed debut. It could be the moment of return. Her offer was not wrong, it was precise. She knew how narratives sold. She believed in Chelsea partly because she believed in the market, partly because, perhaps, she had a soft spot for a woman whose quiet strength masked an interior made of something she admired. Madison listened to all of this like a student at the edges of a class she had not paid to enter. She heard the language of inevitability that Anita used. The word future like a coin that could be flipped to buy a new trajectory. Madison had never wanted to be spectacle. She had wanted some simple, durable intimacy with Chelsea, quiet mornings, unremarkable dinners, a life that fit into itself. The idea that Chelsea could be reshaped into a public symbol made her uneasy for reasons she sometimes struggled to name. She loved Chelsea, and in that love there was a heavy, iron component. Fear that if Chelsea's story belonged to the world would chew it up and spit it out. She feared losing her, of course, but she also feared losing the private Chelsea that belonged to them alone. The possibility that Madison had been a part of Allison's plan was not an accusation. It was the tiny seed of a hypothesis Naomi nurtured with the care of a scientist and the wariness of someone who had been burned by loyalties before. Naomi's suspicion worked through the lattice of small facts she could see. She noted that Madison preferred to meet Chelsea at odd hours, that she had been seen in a bar where Allison had been a regular, that her phone screen glowed on her knees late into the night. Naomi imagined scenarios, layered like settlement, a flirtation turned sour, a bet made by drunk and dangerous people to see what a lover would do, a coercion born from debt. The permutations blossomed into a dozen ugly possibilities. There was a line in Naomi's mind she refused to cross, though the part where she accused without proof. It was a moral boundary that had been paid for by experience. Accusing a person without sufficient evidence could fracture lives in ways that were irreparable. Naomi's strategy was therefore patient: gather facts, watch, and when the time came, let the truth stand on its own. The household around Chelsea became a matrix of gestures and counter-moves. Anita called with offers of help and small, precise demands. She suggested a private showing, a quietening of the public life, an event where allies could be marshaled like soldiers. Kat organized friends and acquaintances, people who would sit in the front rows of a relaunched life and clap at the precise beat it needed. Veronica, a PR manager with sharp fingers, drafted an email that read like a contract: "We control the narrative." Chelsea wanted none of it, and yet part of her understood the logic. Fame, she realized, was a beast that required feeding in order not to gnaw at the furniture of your life. She found herself bargaining with herself about who she would be when the world came calling again. Under all of this, Madison's secret wound itself tighter. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night and find her own hand under the blanket, searching for a pulse not Chelsea's, but her own, as if measuring whether she still existed beyond the things she had done. She thought of Allison smiling at the idea of proving love, and the image made her stomach curl. Some nights, in the emptiness of those hours, she wrote drafts of apologies that never saw the light of day, letters that would have confessed things she could not yet confess out loud. She made excuses to the mirror, telling herself that she had been trying to protect Chelsea from the vagaries of celebrity, one crookedly ethical plan after another. She had convinced herself, once, that spectacle could be sterilized, that danger staged could be contained and used to make them stronger. In the silence she wondered whether love could be manufactured any more than trust could be bought. The people around them moved in orbits that occasionally intersected and often did not. Vernon listened to Anita and nodded, a patient, steady presence who had been worn down by the ways family legends demanded obedience. Kat recited details to anyone who would listen, as if repeating them aloud might sanctify them. Naomi kept an eye on Madison the way a bodyguard keeps a distance. Her silence was active. Chelsea oscillated between the rawest fear and a hopeful strength that sometimes made her wonderful and terrifying to witness. Each of them made decisions small and large that fed the larger engine of what would happen next. There were scenes that would replay in Chelsea's mind forever. The first time she returned to the studio after the rescue, she found the lights too bright and the soundproofing too thin. The cameras seemed to gather like shoreline gulls, waiting for the tide to turn them into dinner. She moved through the day like someone in a costume, her laughter practiced to match the camera's appetite. Every smile felt borrowed. But when she collapsed at night into the arms of someone who truly wanted her, when she pressed her cheek to Madison's throat and smelled the mundane perfume of someone who sleeps nearby, she tasted something like home. She wanted that to be the end of the story, two women reunited, scarred but whole. She wanted to believe in the repair. Naomi wasn't so sanguine. She had watched too many repairs leave hairline cracks that spread like frost in a windshield. She had a memory of a friend who had been drawn into a scheme to prove love and had paid for it with years of guilt and public shaming. The patterns of human miscalculation repeated. Naomi's instinct was to uncover the truth before it could harden into another public narrative that would make forgiveness either impossible or performative. So she began, quietly, to collect evidence in the way that a careful person might collect seashells at low tide. A text message captured on a screen: permission to attend a private event, time-stamped in a way that didn't fit. A photograph, grainy and small, of Madison leaving a cafe at 11 p.m. the night a forwarding address had been registered to Allison's apartment. A package delivered to Madison's building that had no return address, and a weight in Naomi's hand that felt like possibility. Each fragment was alone not very meaningful. Together, though, they suggested not drama but factual shape. Naomi arranged to be near Madison without being obvious. She would pop by with coffee and linger. She would ask after Madison's nights with an interest that hardly masked her concern. Madison would smile too quickly and say nothing. When Naomi finally placed a small, incriminating receipt on the table between them, an orientation collar from a private florist's ledger that matched a wreath pictured in one of Allison's social posts, Madison's face flickered. For a second the mask slipped. Naomi saw something like fear, and then a rush of control that made Madison smooth her features back into the expression she'd learned to wear in public. Naomi had her proof, small, circumstantial, sufficient to ask one decisive question. She didn't ask it right away. She sat across from Madison for a long time and watched the way the afternoon light moved across the coffee table. When Naomi finally spoke, her voice was casual but not unkind. "Tell me everything," she said. Madison's mouth opened and closed. 1,000 defenses rose like a tide of excuses, each one plausible to the person making it. "I can explain," she began. Her eyes flicked to the window like an animal searching for escape routes. "It was supposed to be controlled." "Allison," she cut herself off and laughed, a dull sound that had no humor in it. "You're thinking the worst." Naomi's thumb rubbed circles on the tabletop. "I'm thinking the truth," she said. "If you were involved, Madison, it's better that we know now than later. There's a difference between trying to keep someone and hurting them." Madison swallowed, and the secret she had kept for weeks, for months, perhaps, in the way that slow rationalizations calcify into commitments, trembled at the edge of her teeth. She thought of Chelsea's arms, of the way Chelsea had clung and whispered that what mattered was that they were together. She thought of Allison's smile, the softness of her voice when she explained that tests make love pure. She thought of the wallet launch Anita wanted to salvage, and of the idea that the world could be bent into a story where Chelsea's return was triumph and not tragedy. Madison could not decide whether she had been an instrument or a victim of calculation. The answer, like all important things, was both. She looked at Naomi, into the eyes of a woman whose life had trained her to read the room for what it hid. "I wanted her to stay," Madison said finally, the confession a small, naked thing. "I thought if she saw how much I would fight for her, if she thought she'd lose me, she would choose differently." Naomi didn't speak for a moment. The idea was human and devastatingly stupid. It had the logic of a lover who becomes desperate and chooses a trash fire because it promises warmth. "You put her in danger," Naomi said softly. "Whether you meant to or not." Madison's face crumpled, not into melodrama but into a stunning, real grief. "I know," she said. "I thought I could control it. I thought." Outside, in the world that had once been the sole arbiter of Chelsea's public life, everything waited. Cameras hungrily scanned for the first hint of fracture. Anita had been making calls about a comeback. Kat had purchased dresses and lipstick shades the color of victory. Vernon had his own quiet counsel, suggesting strategy and schedules. And inside the small apartment, the real work of reckoning had begun. Madison's secret had been teased into the open like a loose thread. It trembled now, visible and vulnerable. The house that had held so many small comforts suddenly felt like a room with a thin wall between it and the world. If the story that Naomi suspected were true, then a love that had been a sanctuary could be recast as a wound inflicted by one of its own. That possibility hung between them like an accusation that wanted to be spoken aloud and also refused to be named. Chelsea, who had returned to a life she had not chosen, deserved answers that were honest and not purchased by myth or spin. Naomi's next move was a decision made quietly and with an economy of words. She folded the small receipt and slid it back across the table to Madison. "Tell her," Naomi said. "Tell Chelsea now, before anyone else decides for her." The words were a directive and a plea. The truth had to travel up from the floor and into the light, messy and raw, before it calcified into a public spectacle that would be harder to dismantle. Madison looked at the paper in her hand and then at Naomi. The secret that had been worn like a second skin trembled. The distance between confession and confession's consequences spread taut like wire. She reached for the phone, fingers shaking as if the device were hot. In the room across the hall, a kettle began to hiss on the stove, the mundane sound of domesticity that felt almost obscene. Chelsea was in the kitchen, humming as she put sugar into a mug, an ordinary habit that made Madison's chest ache with the sort of tenderness that often precedes catastrophe. Madison began to speak, and in the hum of the apartment the first thread of explanation slipped out, fragile and impossible to stitch back together. The world beyond their door pressed closer, patient and hungry, waiting for the story to be finished, for the ending to arrive like a verdict.